Hey night traveler, welcome to the Stealth Podcast. Here, you'll hear chilling stories to help you drift to sleep or keep you awake. Before we start, drop a comment telling me what time you're tuning in and where you're listening from. Now, kill the lights, put your headphones on, and let's hit the road. My name is Marlene Schaefer. I'm 34 years old, and I live in Portland, Oregon. I'd been planning this California road trip for months. Just me, my renovated 2015 Ford Transit, and the open road. My best friend Cassidy tried to convince me to wait until her vacation time lined up with mine, but I was too eager. I needed to escape the gray Portland skies and the suffocating routine of my graphic design job. So there I was, driving south through California, chasing sunshine and that freedom everyone talks about when they quit their 9-to-5. Except I hadn't quit mine. I was just taking 2 weeks to pretend I had. The day started perfect. I'd spent the morning exploring giant forest, walking among those massive sequoias that make you feel like an ant. By late afternoon, I was looking for a place to park for the night. Most of the official campgrounds were packed with families and RVs the size of small houses. I wanted something quieter, more secluded. That's when I found the old logging road about 15 miles east of Three Rivers. It wasn't marked on my GPS, just a dirt path branching off Highway 198 that looked like it hadn't seen much traffic in years. The trees created this tunnel effect, and about half a mile in, there was a clearing, perfect size for my van, with enough space to set up my camp chair and actually enjoy the forest without neighbors blasting country music. I pulled in around 6:30, just as the light was starting to get that golden quality photographers obsess over. The spot felt a bit isolated, sure, but that's what I wanted. I could hear a creek somewhere nearby, and the air smelled like pine and earth. I did my usual setup, leveled the van, cracked the back windows for airflow, hung my solar lantern from the awning. I made myself a quick dinner on my portable stove, nothing fancy, just ramen with some vegetables I'd picked up in Visalia. While I ate, I scrolled through my phone, posted a photo of the forest to Instagram with some caption about finding myself in nature. The irony of seeking solitude while broadcasting it to 300 followers wasn't lost on me, but whatever. I had 1 bar of service, which I figured was good enough for emergencies. Around 8, I noticed a truck pass by on the main part of the logging road. Didn't come down to my clearing, just drove past slowly. It was an older model, dark green or maybe brown, hard to tell in the fading light. I thought maybe it was a ranger or someone else looking for a spot to camp. It kept going, and I didn't think much of it. I was more focused on the fact that I'd forgotten to download the rest of my audiobook before losing decent service. So I settled for some music instead, keeping it low because I actually wanted to hear the forest sounds. There's something disturbing about being in nature and drowning it out with noise, you know? I wanted the real experience, the wind in the trees, the birds settling in for the night, maybe an owl if I was lucky. By 9:30, it was properly dark. Not city dark where there's always some ambient light bleeding from somewhere, but that thick, heavy darkness you only get in remote places. My solar lantern cast this small bubble of light around the van, and beyond that, it was just black. I was sitting in my camp chair, wrapped in a blanket because the temperature had dropped faster than I expected when I heard a vehicle again. Same slow pace as before, or at least it seemed that way. This time, I saw headlights briefly illuminate the trees at the entrance to my clearing before the vehicle stopped. The engine cut off. I sat up straighter, listening. Car doors opened. I counted 2 distinct sounds, and then voices. Male voices, too far away for me to make out words, but definitely talking to each other. My first thought was that they were just other campers looking for a spot, maybe debating whether this area was taken. I waited for them to get back in their vehicle and leave, but instead, I heard footsteps on the gravel and dirt. They were walking toward my clearing, not driving. That's when my stomach did this little flip, that instinctive reaction your body has before your brain fully processes why something feels wrong. I stood up, trying to look casual, and called out, "Hello? Can I help you?" My voice sounded way more confident than I felt. 2 figures emerged from the darkness into the edge of my lantern's light. Both men, probably in their 30s or early 40s. Wearing jeans and hoodies. One was tall and lean, the other shorter but stockier. The tall one smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Hey there," he said. "Didn't mean to startle you. We're just camping up the road a bit. Saw your light. Wanted to make sure you weren't having any trouble out here alone." The way he said alone made my skin crawl. I forced a smile and kept my voice steady. "Nope, all good here. Just enjoying the quiet." The shorter guy hadn't said anything yet, just stood there looking at my van and my setup like he was taking inventory. The tall one, I noticed he had this scar running through his left eyebrow, nodded slowly. "That's a nice rig you got. You travel alone often?" There it was again, that emphasis that made the question feel less like conversation and more like surveillance. I shrugged, lying through my teeth. "My boyfriend's actually meeting me here tomorrow morning. He's driving up from Fresno." The scar-browed guy exchanged a glance with his buddy, and I saw something pass between them. Not belief, that's for sure. Cool, he said. "Well, if you need anything, we're just up the road like I said. Name's Derek." He extended his hand, and I really didn't want to shake it, but refusing felt like it would escalate something I was trying to keep calm. His hand was rough and cold, and he held mine a second too long. I pulled away and wrapped my arms around myself, suddenly aware of how vulnerable I was in my tank top and leggings. "Thanks, but I'm actually about to head to bed. Long day of hiking." Derek smiled that empty smile again. "Sure thing. You be careful out here. Never know who might be wandering around these woods at night." The way he said it felt like a threat dressed up as friendly advice. They finally turned and walked back toward the darkness, and I heard their footsteps fade, then the sound of a car door, an engine starting. But they didn't drive away. I heard the truck move, but it sounded like it was just repositioning, maybe pulling further down the logging road. My heart was hammering so hard I could feel it in my throat. I went straight into my van and locked both doors, then closed all the curtains I'd installed on the windows. My hands were shaking as I grabbed my phone. Still just one bar, but enough to send a text. I messaged Cassidy. "Weird encounter with some guys at my camping spot. Probably nothing, but feeling uneasy. Near 3 Rivers if you don't hear from me." I watched the message sit there with the sending indicator spinning, and after what felt like forever, it finally showed delivered. I thought about calling 911, but in saying what? 2 guys introduced themselves and walked away. I'd sound paranoid, but every instinct I had was screaming that something was very wrong. I'd read enough true crime stories, listened to enough podcasts about women who ignored their gut feelings and paid for it. I sat on my bed in the back of the van, barely breathing, just listening. For maybe 20 minutes, there was nothing but normal forest sounds, wind, branches creaking, some animal rustling in the underbrush. I started to think maybe I was overreacting, that they really were just campers being neighborly in a weird way. Then I heard it. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, trying to be quiet, but not quite succeeding on the gravel and dry leaves. They were circling my van. I could track the sound moving from the driver's side to the back, then around to the passenger side. My solar lantern was still on outside, and through a tiny gap in my curtain, I could see a shadow pass by the window. Not 2 shadows, 3. There was a third person I hadn't seen before. One of them tried the door handle on the passenger side. Just once, gently, like they were testing it. My blood went ice cold. I grabbed my phone, and this time I did dial 911, and thank God it connected. The dispatcher answered, and I whispered as quietly as I could while still being heard. "I'm in a van on an old logging road off Highway 198, about 15 miles east of 3 Rivers. There are 3 men circling my vehicle, and one just tried to open my door. I'm locked inside, but I need help." She stayed on the line with me, asking for more specific details, keeping me talking. I could hear her typing, dispatching officers. She said it would take time. I was in a remote area, nearest sheriff station was 30 minutes away. 30 minutes felt like a lifetime. The men weren't being subtle anymore. I heard one of them say, "She's awake. I can hear her talking." Another voice, one I hadn't heard before, younger, more aggressive, said, "So what? There's 3 of us." They started talking amongst themselves, debating something, and I caught fragments. "Teach her not to," and "No cameras out here." That's when Derek's voice cut through, louder. "Marlene, come on out. We just want to talk. Maybe party a little. You seemed tense earlier." How did he know my name? Then I remembered my Instagram post. I'd tagged my location generally, and my profile had my first name. These guys had probably been watching, waiting for solo travelers, especially women. The dispatcher heard everything and kept reassuring me that help was coming, to stay locked inside, not to engage. The van started rocking slightly. One of them was pushing against it, testing how sturdy it was, trying to scare me. The rocking got more violent, and I heard one of them laugh, that younger voice, finding this whole thing entertaining. I was pressed against the far wall of my van, phone clutched to my ear, while the dispatcher kept talking to me in this calm, professional tone that was probably meant to be soothing, but just reminded me how not calm my situation was. Officers are en route, Marlene. Estimated arrival is 23 minutes. Stay on the line with me. Do not open the door under any circumstances. Like I needed to be told that. The van lurched hard to one side, and I heard Derek say, "Marco, grab that tire iron from the truck." My stomach dropped. They were going to break in. These weren't just creepy guys trying to intimidate me. They had a plan, and it was escalating fast. I frantically looked around my van for anything I could use as a weapon. I had a small knife I used for cooking, a hammer I kept for van repairs, a can of wasp spray that someone once told me worked like pepper spray in emergencies. I grabbed the hammer and the wasp spray, feeling ridiculous and terrified at the same time. Through the front windshield, I could see shadows moving in my headlights' range. I'd forgotten to turn them off earlier, and now they were giving me just enough light to see shapes. The stocky guy from earlier appeared in view, and he was holding something long and metal. He walked up to the passenger window, and I heard him say, "Last chance, sweetheart. Open up and this goes easy. Make us work for it, and it goes hard." His voice was flat, matter-of-fact, like he'd done this before. The dispatcher's voice got more urgent. "Marlene, I need you to make noise. Honk your horn. Turn on all your lights. Make yourself visible and loud. The officers need to be able to find you quickly, and noise might deter them." I lunged for the driver's seat and started laying on the horn. Long, sustained blasts that shattered the quiet forest night. I flipped on every light I had. Headlights, high beams, hazards, the interior lights, even my emergency LED strips. My van lit up like a beacon, and I kept hammering that horn over and over. The men scattered initially, surprised by the sudden noise and light, and I heard cursing. But then Derek's voice cut through. "Doesn't matter. No one's out here to hear it anyway. Marco, break the window." The sound of metal hitting glass is something I'll never forget. That sharp crack followed by the spider webbing of my passenger window. It didn't shatter completely on the first hit. Those windows are tougher than regular car glass, but I could see the damage spreading. He hit it again, and this time a chunk fell inward, landing on my passenger seat. Cold night air rushed in along with Derek's hand, reaching through to unlock the door. I didn't think, just reacted. I aimed the wasp spray through the broken window and let it rip. I heard him scream, stumbling backward, and the hand disappeared. My eyes. That bitch sprayed something in my eyes. Good. I hoped it hurt. The dispatcher was still talking. "Officers are 15 minutes out. You're doing great, Marlene. Keep defending yourself. Stay on the line." But 15 minutes was an eternity. The younger one, Marco, was at the back doors now, and I could hear him working on the lock with something, probably trying to pick it or pry it open. The third guy, the one I still hadn't gotten a good look at, was at the driver's door doing the same thing. They were coordinating, attacking from multiple points, and I was trapped in the middle with limited weapons and no real plan. I crawled to the back and started kicking at the door from the inside every time I heard Marco manipulating the lock, trying to jam whatever he was using. My foot connected with the door hard enough that I heard him grunt in pain. She kicked me. Fucking kicked right through the door. He sounded more angry than hurt, which wasn't great for me. Derek had recovered enough from the wasp spray to rejoin the effort, though I could hear him sniffling and cursing. "Forget the locks," he said, voice rough and furious. "Just break everything. Windows, lights, whatever. Make her come out." That's when I realized they weren't even trying to hide their intentions anymore. They were committed, past the point of pretending this was anything other than what it was. The scary part wasn't just that they were attacking my van. It was the casualness of it, the certainty that they'd succeed eventually. Like they'd done this before and knew how it ended. I thought about all the missing persons cases I'd read about, all the women who vanished from remote areas, and wondered if I was about to become another statistic. The hammer felt pathetically small in my hand. Then I heard the most beautiful sound in the world, sirens. Faint at first, just barely audible over the men's noise and my own ragged breathing, but growing louder by the second. The three of them froze, and I heard Marco say, "Cops." How did she? Derek cut him off. "Doesn't matter. Move. Now." Footsteps scrambled in different directions, and I heard their truck engine roar to life. Through my cracked windshield, I saw headlights swing around as they tried to maneuver out of the narrow logging road. But the sirens were getting closer, and I could see red and blue lights flickering through the trees now. The dispatcher's voice came through my phone, calm and relieved. "Officers are on scene, Marlene. Stay in your vehicle until they identify themselves to you. You're safe now." I was shaking so hard I could barely hold the phone. I heard the men's truck accelerate, gravel spraying, and then the sound of it crashing through brush. They'd gone off-road, trying to escape through the forest itself. But this wasn't some action movie where the bad guys vanish into the night. Within seconds, I heard more vehicles arriving, multiple engines, doors slamming, voices shouting commands. "Sheriff's Department, stop the vehicle. Hands where we can see them." There was a loud crash, the sound of metal hitting something solid. A tree, maybe, and then more shouting. I stayed frozen in my van, still clutching my ridiculous hammer and empty wasp spray can, listening to the chaos outside and trying to process that I was actually going to survive this. A knock on my driver's side window made me jump, even though I'd been expecting it. "Ma'am, this is Deputy Torres with the Tulare County Sheriff's Office. You're safe now. Can you unlock the door?" I looked out and saw a woman in uniform, her face kind but professional, and I've never been so happy to see a cop in my life. My hands were shaking so bad it took me 3 tries to unlock the door. The moment it opened, everything I'd been holding back just crashed over me. I started crying, these ugly, gasping sobs, and Deputy Torres helped me out of the van. My legs barely worked. They felt like jelly, and I half collapsed against the side of my van. She steadied me, radiating this calm competence that made me feel like maybe I could actually fall apart now because someone else was in control. The scene around me was chaotic but organized. There were at least 4 sheriff's vehicles, their lights turning the dark forest into a strobing nightmare. I could see the men's truck maybe 50 feet away, its front end crumpled against a massive pine tree. 2 deputies had Derek and the stocky guy on the ground, hands being cuffed behind their backs. Derek's face was red and swollen from the wasp spray, and I felt zero sympathy. A 3rd deputy was leading Marco out of the woods. He'd apparently tried to run on foot, but didn't get far. He was younger than I'd thought, maybe mid-20s, with this entitled anger on his face like he couldn't believe he'd actually been caught. Deputy Torres wrapped a blanket around my shoulders and guided me to sit in the open door of her patrol car, away from my destroyed van. "Can you tell me what happened?" she asked, pulling out a notepad. And I did. Everything, from the initial approach by Derek and his friend, to the circling, the attempted break-in, all of it. My voice kept breaking, and I had to stop several times to collect myself, but she was patient. Another officer came over partway through, introduced himself as Sergeant Reeves, and he had this look on his face, grim satisfaction mixed with something darker. "Miss Schaefer, I need you to know that you probably saved your own life tonight. We've been looking for these 3 for almost 6 weeks. They're connected to 2 assaults on solo female campers in Kern and Fresno counties, and we've suspected them in at least 1 disappearance. The way you handled this, staying locked in, calling 911, making noise, that's textbook survival response." The weight of those words hit me like a truck. 2 assaults, 1 disappearance. I could have been the next one, another woman who vanished into the forest because she wanted some peace and solitude. The sergeant continued, "They've been targeting women traveling alone, using social media to track locations, looking for remote spots where they thought they'd have time. Your quick thinking and that 911 call didn't give them that time." I watched as the 3 men were loaded into separate patrol cars, and Derek looked back at me, his swollen eyes full of rage. I met his stare and didn't look away. He was the one in handcuffs, not me. Deputy Torres told me I'd need to give a full statement, that my van would be processed as evidence, and that they'd arrange for me to stay somewhere safe for the night. I nodded numbly, still trying to wrap my head around the fact that this nightmare was actually over. They brought me to a small motel in 3 Rivers around 2 in the morning, one of those single-story places with rooms that opened directly to the parking lot. Deputy Torres stayed with me while another officer arranged everything with the manager, a kind older woman who took one look at me wrapped in that emergency blanket and insisted on giving me the nicest room they had, refusing payment. Torres helped me inside, made sure I had water and her direct phone number, and told me a victim advocate would contact me in the morning. Before she left, she squeezed my shoulder and said, You did everything right, Marlene. Remember that." I locked the door behind her, threw the deadbolt, wedged a chair under the handle for good measure, and finally let myself completely fall apart. I sat on the bathroom floor and cried for maybe an hour straight, all the terror I'd been holding back just pouring out. When the sun came up, I was still awake, sitting on the bed staring at nothing. My phone had been blowing up since around 6. Cassidy had seen my message from the night before and called about 20 times in a panic. I finally answered, and she was crying before I even said hello. I gave her the abbreviated version, told her I was okay, told her the guys were arrested. She wanted to drive down immediately, but I convinced her I'd be fine, that I just needed some time to process everything. The victim advocate arrived around 9, a woman named Patricia who'd clearly done this many times before. She walked me through what would happen next, statements, possible court appearances, counseling resources. She also told me something that made my blood run cold. They'd found zip ties, duct tape, and a tarp in the men's truck, along with 2 phones that didn't belong to any of them. The investigation was still unfolding, but it was looking worse than even Sergeant Reeves had initially thought. They weren't just opportunistic predators. They'd been organized, systematic. One of the phones belonged to a woman who'd been reported missing 3 months ago after a camping trip near Bakersfield. Patricia didn't give me details, didn't need to. I could fill in the horrifying blanks myself. I spent the next 2 days in 3 Rivers, giving statements, working with the sheriff's department, dealing with my insurance company about the van. They'd towed it to an evidence facility, and the adjuster who looked at it said the damage was extensive but reparable. The broken window, the attempted forced entry on the doors, the dents from where they'd been hitting it. All of it documented, photographed, cataloged as evidence in a case that was apparently growing bigger by the hour. By the 3rd day, news crews had gotten wind of the story. A local station ran a piece. 3 men arrested in connection with multiple attacks on solo campers. They used my incident as the headline, but were vague about my identity, which I appreciated. Still, my phone started getting messages from people I hadn't talked to in years. Everyone suddenly concerned about my safety, wanting the story. I ignored most of them. The only person I really talked to was Cassidy, who'd started researching self-defense classes and personal safety devices, sending me links at all hours. Her way of processing trauma, I guess, even though it was my trauma. My mom called crying, begging me to come home to Portland, to give up this van life nonsense, as she called it. I didn't have the energy to explain that this wasn't about van life. It could have happened in a tent, a cabin, anywhere. Bad people exist everywhere. The sheriff's department kept me updated as the case developed. All 3 men were being held without bail, charged with attempted kidnapping, assault, conspiracy, and a growing list of other charges as evidence mounted. Marco, the youngest one, started talking almost immediately, trying to cut a deal. According to Detective Reeves, who called me personally, Marco admitted they'd been doing this for almost 8 months, starting small with theft and harassment before escalating to assault. Derek was apparently the ringleader, the one who'd done time before for similar crimes in Nevada. The 3rd guy, whose name I learned was Craig, had a record too: domestic violence, stalking. They'd found each other through some online forum, bonded over their hatred of women who they thought were asking for it by traveling alone. That phrase made me want to vomit. A month later, I was back in Portland, staying with Cassidy while I figured out my next move. My van was repaired and sitting in a storage facility because I couldn't bring myself to sleep in it yet, maybe ever. I'd started therapy, twice-a-week sessions where I talked through the attack and the guilt I felt about the woman whose phone they'd found. Survivor's guilt, my therapist called it. Why did I get to live when she didn't? I'd testified before a grand jury, helped ensure all 3 men were indicted on multiple counts across several counties. The trial wouldn't happen for months, maybe a year, but the prosecutor was confident. They had evidence, testimony, a pattern of behavior. These men wouldn't hurt anyone else. That thought was the only thing that gave me any peace. I'd stopped their spree, even if accidentally, even if I'd just been trying to save myself. Sometimes I still wake up hearing footsteps circling my van, feeling it rock as someone pushes against it. But then I remember, they're in jail. I'm here. I survived, and that has to be enough. My name is Vincent Kowalski. I'm 47 years old, and I live in Reno, Nevada. I'd been living out of my 2008 Chevy Express van for about 3 years at that point, not by necessity, but by choice. I'd sold my house after my divorce, paid off my debts, and decided that the whole suburban dream was overrated. My ex-wife thought I'd lost my mind, and maybe I had, but I was happier in 200 square feet of freedom than I'd ever been in that 3-bedroom prison we'd shared. I worked remotely as a freelance web developer, so as long as I had my laptop and decent internet every few days, I could be anywhere. And that particular November, I wanted to be somewhere warm. Reno was getting cold, and Death Valley in winter is actually perfect, not the hellscape it is in summer. I drove down through Tonopah and hit Death Valley National Park around mid-afternoon on a Tuesday. The place was relatively empty, which was exactly what I wanted. I'd been there twice before, knew some of the spots tourists usually skip. I wasn't interested in Badwater Basin or Zabriskie Point with all the Instagram crowds. I wanted isolation, silence, that weird lunar landscape that makes you feel like you've driven onto another planet. I headed toward the racetrack playa area, way out in the northwest section of the park. The road getting there is rough, unpaved for the last stretch, and it filters out anyone without decent clearance. My van handled it fine. I'd upgraded the suspension specifically for roads like this. By the time I reached the area, it was late afternoon, and I had the whole valley to myself. I found a spot off the main track, pulled maybe half a mile down what used to be an old mining road. There was this abandoned structure there. Couldn't tell if it had been a shack or some kind of mining equipment housing, but it was just a few walls now, made of weathered wood and corrugated metal that looked like it might blow away in a strong wind. The setting sun was hitting the mountains in that way that makes them look purple and orange at the same time, shadows stretching across the valley floor. I set up my usual routine, solar panels out, camp stove ready, folding chair position to watch the sunset. I made coffee. Yeah, coffee at 5 p.m., but that's one of the perks of making your own schedule, and just sat there taking it all in. No phone service, no internet, no noise except wind and the occasional sound of something settling in that old structure. As it got dark, the temperature dropped fast. That's the thing about deserts people don't realize. They assume it's always hot, but winter nights in Death Valley can get down to freezing. I prepared for it though, had my sleeping bag rated for 20 degrees, a propane heater I could run safely for a few hours. I made myself dinner, some freeze-dried camping meal that tasted like cardboard but filled me up. While I ate, I noticed something odd about that abandoned structure. There were footprints around it, fresh ones, in the dust. Not mine. I hadn't walked over there yet. They led from the dirt road up to the structure and then seemed to circle it a few times before heading back toward the road. Could have been from earlier in the day, another explorer or photographer. Death Valley attracts all types, especially people who like the remote areas. I finished eating and decided to walk over to the structure, mostly out of curiosity. I had my headlamp on, bright LED cutting through the darkness. As I got closer, I could see the footprints more clearly. Looked like boots, size 10 or 11 maybe, definitely an adult. They were recent enough that the edges hadn't been softened by wind yet. I reached the structure and shined my light inside. It was mostly empty, just some old rusted equipment I couldn't identify, a lot of sand and debris blown in over the years. But in the corner, there was something that made me pause. A sleeping bag. Not an old one, not trash, a relatively new sleeping bag, rolled up and tucked against the wall. Next to it was a backpack, the kind hikers use, and a couple of water bottles. Someone was camping here, or had been recently. The weird thing was, there was no vehicle anywhere nearby. I'd driven the only road in, and I hadn't passed anyone. The nearest actual campground was miles away, and hiking out here with full gear in November seemed crazy, even for experienced backpackers. I stood there for a minute, debating whether to call out, see if someone was around. But something about the whole setup felt off. The sleeping bag and backpack were positioned like someone had hidden them, tucked deliberately out of sight, not just set down casually. And why would someone camp in this deteriorating structure when they could camp literally anywhere in this vast empty space? I decided not to call out, not to advertise my presence. I backed away slowly, turned off my headlamp once I was clear of the structure, and walked back to my van using just the moonlight. My instinct was screaming at me that I'd stumbled onto something I wasn't supposed to see. I got back to my van and locked both doors immediately, which is something I rarely did in remote locations. Usually, I love the feeling of keeping the side door cracked open, letting the night air flow through, but not tonight. I sat in the driver's seat for a while, just watching that structure through my windshield. The moonlight was bright enough that I could see its silhouette about 200 yards away, this dark shape against the lighter desert floor. Nothing moved. No lights appeared. But I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was over there, watching me the same way I was watching that building. I thought about driving out, finding another spot, but the idea of navigating that rough road in complete darkness didn't appeal to me. Plus, I kept telling myself I was being paranoid. Maybe it was just a hiker who'd cached some supplies and would come back for them later. Around 9 o'clock, I saw it. A light, small and brief, like someone had turned on a flashlight for just a second inside that structure. It was so quick I almost thought I'd imagined it, but then it happened again a few minutes later. Someone was definitely in there, and they were trying not to be seen. My mouth went dry. I thought about what legitimate reason someone would have for hiding in an abandoned building in the middle of Death Valley at night, and I couldn't come up with anything good. Fugitive was the first word that came to mind. Someone running from the law, hiding out in the most isolated place they could find. Or maybe something worse. Someone who came out here specifically because they knew it was empty, because they had something to hide or something to do that required absolute privacy. I pulled out my satellite communicator, one of those Garmin InReach devices I'd bought specifically for situations like this, where cell service didn't exist. It was expensive, but moments like this made it worth every penny. I typed out a message to my buddy Ray back in Reno, at Racetrack Playa area. Found someone camping in abandoned structure, acting suspicious. No vehicle visible. Might be nothing but feels wrong. I hit send and watched the message transmit. Ray was former military, worked in security, and most importantly, he knew I wasn't the type to panic over nothing. If something happened to me, at least someone would know where to start looking. That thought wasn't as comforting as I'd hoped it would be. For the next hour, nothing happened. No more lights from the structure. No movement that I could see. I started to relax a little, convince myself that maybe whoever was over there was just as spooked by me as I was by them, that we were two people trying to avoid each other in the desert. I ran my heater for a bit to take the edge off the cold, made another cup of coffee from my French press. I was debating whether to just try to sleep, keep my keys in the ignition in case I needed to leave fast, when I heard it. A sound that didn't belong. Metal scraping against metal, faint but distinct. It was coming from behind my van, near the back doors. Every muscle in my body tensed. I turned off my interior light immediately and sat in darkness, listening. The scraping came again, deliberate and slow, like someone was testing the lock on my back doors with a tool. My van has decent security. I'd installed deadbolts on both the side door and back doors after hearing too many stories about van break-ins. But someone determined enough with the right tools could probably get through eventually. I reached under my seat and pulled out the tire iron I kept there. It wasn't much, but it was heavy metal and better than nothing. My heart was hammering so hard I could hear blood rushing in my ears. The scraping stopped, and for a moment there was just silence. Then I heard footsteps, slow and careful, moving along the passenger side of the van toward the front. I could see a shadow pass by my passenger window, blocking the moonlight for a second. Whoever it was stopped at the passenger door, and I heard them try the handle. Locked. Thank God I'd actually locked up tonight. The person moved to the windshield, and that's when I got my first real look at them. A man, average height, wearing dark clothes and a beanie pulled low. He had a scraggly beard and his face was gaunt, almost skeletal. He pressed his hands against my windshield, cupping them around his eyes to see inside. I was sitting perfectly still in the driver's seat, barely breathing, and I don't think he could see me in the darkness. He stood there for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 30 seconds, then backed away. I watched him walk in a slow circle around my van, like he was evaluating it, planning something. Then he turned and walked back toward the structure, disappearing into the darkness. I sat there trembling, trying to figure out what the hell I'd just witnessed. This wasn't someone who'd stumbled across my van and was curious. This was someone scouting, someone with bad intentions. The way he'd tested my doors, the way he'd pressed his face against the windshield, that was predatory behavior. I grabbed my satellite communicator again and sent another message to Ray. Men just circled my van, tried the doors. Definitely not friendly. Don't know what to do. No cell service. Closest help is hours away. The message sent, and I stared at the screen waiting for a response. It took about 5 minutes, which felt like forever, but Ray finally replied, "Get out of there now. Don't wait. Drive to the ranger station at Furnace Creek. I'm calling park service for you." He was right. I needed to leave. But the problem was that abandoned structure sat between me and the road out. I'd have to drive past it, and if this guy had friends, if there were more people hiding out there, I could be driving into an ambush. The alternative was to stay locked in my van until morning and hope nothing worse happened. But that felt like waiting to become a victim. I started my engine, and the sound was deafening in the silent desert. I flipped on my headlights, put the van in gear, and started moving. My plan was simple: drive fast, don't stop for anything, get to pavement, and then to people. As I approached the structure, I kept my eyes locked on it, half expecting someone to jump out into my path. But as my headlights swept across the building, I saw something that made my blood turn to ice. There weren't just one set of footprints around the structure anymore. There were multiple sets, all fresh, leading in different directions. And standing in the doorway of that ruined building was the gaunt man, but he wasn't alone. There were 2 others with him, and they were all just standing there, watching my van approach. They didn't move, didn't wave, didn't do anything except stare. It was the most disturbing thing I'd ever seen. 3 silhouettes backlit by my headlights, completely still like they were waiting for something. I pressed the accelerator harder, my van bouncing over the rough terrain as I sped past them. In my rearview mirror, I saw them start moving, walking quickly toward where I'd been parked. The road seemed endless, every rock and pothole threatening to blow a tire or damage my suspension. I didn't care. I just kept my foot on the gas, one hand on the wheel and one hand on my satellite communicator in case I needed to send an emergency SOS. It took me almost 40 minutes to reach the paved road. 40 minutes of sheer terror where every shadow looked like a person and every sound made me think something was wrong with the van. When I finally hit pavement, I actually started crying, not sobbing, just tears running down my face from the relief of being back in civilization, or at least closer to it. I drove straight to Furnace Creek, didn't stop, didn't slow down except when I absolutely had to. The ranger station was closed when I got there around 11 at night, but there was an emergency phone outside. I picked it up and it connected to dispatch immediately. I explained everything. The structure, the man circling my van, the 3 figures watching me leave. The dispatcher said rangers were already en route to the area based on a call from someone named Ray, and that I should stay at the visitor center parking lot until they could take my statement. I pulled into the lot and parked under the brightest light I could find, right next to the entrance. There were a few other vehicles there, other campers or late-night visitors, and I'd never been so happy to be around other people. I sat there with my doors locked, engine running, heat blasting, just trying to calm down. 2 park rangers arrived about 20 minutes later in separate vehicles. One was older, maybe in his 50s, with gray hair and this weathered look that said he'd seen a lot in his career. The other was younger, a woman probably in her 30s. They introduced themselves as Ranger Dixon and Ranger Alvarez. I told them everything again, and Dixon's expression got darker as I talked. When I finished, he and Alvarez exchanged this look that told me they knew something I didn't. Dixon said, "Mr. Kowalski, we've had reports about that area before. About 3 weeks ago, a couple reported seeing someone living in that structure, said they felt threatened. We sent rangers out, but didn't find anyone. 2 months before that, a solo hiker reported his camp was ransacked while he was out exploring during the day, lost all his food and water." Alvarez added, "We think someone's been squatting out there long term, someone who doesn't want to be found." Dixon told me they were going to send a team out at first light to investigate the area, but going in at night with potentially dangerous people out there wasn't protocol unless there was an immediate threat to life. I understood that, even though part of me wanted them to go right now, to catch whoever those people were before they disappeared again. Alvarez took detailed notes about everything, the exact location, descriptions of the men, the footprints, the gear I'd seen. She asked if I'd be willing to go back with them in the morning to show them the spot, and honestly, the last thing I wanted was to return to that place. But I said yes anyway, because I kept thinking about the next person who might camp out there, some family or solo traveler who wouldn't be as lucky as me. They let me stay in the visitor center parking lot for the night, said they'd check on me periodically. I didn't sleep, not really. I dozed off a few times, but kept jerking awake, convinced I heard footsteps outside my van or saw shadows moving past the windows. Every time a car pulled into the parking lot, my heart rate spiked. By the time the sun came up around 6:30, I was exhausted and jittery from too much coffee and adrenaline. Dixon and Alvarez returned around 7 with 2 other rangers and a Park Service law enforcement vehicle. They asked if I was ready, and I nodded even though I absolutely wasn't. We formed a small convoy, me following their vehicles back out toward the racetrack playa area, back toward that structure that I'd hoped never to see again. The drive in daylight was surreal. Everything that had seemed so menacing in the dark just looked empty and desolate now. We reached the area where I'd camped, and I showed them exactly where my van had been parked, pointed out the structure. The Rangers approached it carefully, hands on their weapons, calling out that they were Park Service and anyone inside needed to come out. Nothing. They went inside, and I watched from a distance, my stomach in knots. After a few minutes, Dixon emerged and waved me over. I walked to the structure reluctantly, and when I looked inside, my breath caught. The sleeping bag and backpack I'd seen last night were gone, but there was evidence someone had been living there: food wrappers, empty water bottles, a small fire pit that looked recently used. What really disturbed me was what Alvarez found half buried in the sand in the corner: a wallet. She pulled it out carefully using a pen, not touching it directly, and opened it. Inside was an ID card for a man named David Chun, age 32, from Los Angeles. Dixon got on his radio immediately, calling in the name to check for warrants or missing person reports. While we waited, the Rangers spread out, looking for more evidence. They found a second campsite about a quarter-mile away, hidden behind some rocks. More gear, more trash, and something that made my skin crawl: photographs. Polaroids of vehicles, RVs, vans, all taken from a distance. Some of them had notes written on the back in messy handwriting: dates, times, license plate numbers. My van wasn't in the photos, but that's only because they probably hadn't had time to add it to their collection yet. Dixon's radio crackled, and dispatch came back with information. David Chun was reported missing 6 months ago after telling his family he was going camping in Death Valley. His car had been found abandoned near the park entrance, but no trace of him was ever discovered. They'd assumed he'd gotten lost or had an accident in the desert, that his body would turn up eventually. But now it looked like something else had happened. The Rangers called in additional support, and soon there were crime scene techs and investigators swarming the area. I gave my statement again to a detective who'd driven in from the county sheriff's office, and he told me they were treating this as a potential homicide investigation now. Those men I'd seen weren't just squatters. They were likely involved in Chen's disappearance, and possibly others. Over the next few hours, they found more evidence. Another campsite, more photographs, a journal with disturbing entries about visitors to the area and which ones were easy targets. The detective wouldn't share details, but his expression told me everything I needed to know about how dark this was getting. They asked if I could identify any of the men from photos they showed me, mugshots of known criminals and transients who'd been reported in the area. I looked through dozens of faces, and on the third sheet, I found him. The gaunt man who'd circled my van. His name was Leonard Pritchard, and he had a record going back 20 years: assault, robbery, weapons charges. He'd been released from prison 8 months ago and had apparently vanished into Death Valley. The other 2 men they were still working on identifying. The Rangers and detectives launched a massive search operation that lasted 3 days. They brought in helicopters, search dogs, and teams of officers to comb through hundreds of square miles of desert. I stayed in a motel in Beatty, just outside the park, checking my phone obsessively for updates even though I had the detective's direct number and he'd promised to call if anything major developed. On the second day, they found Leonard Pritchard. He'd been hiding in an old mine shaft about 10 miles from the structure, surviving on cash supplies. When they cornered him, he tried to run but collapsed from dehydration and heat exhaustion within a few hundred yards. They arrested him on the spot, and he was airlifted to a hospital under armed guard. The other 2 men took longer to find. One of them, identified as Marcus Webb through fingerprints found at the campsites, was discovered on the 3rd day trying to hitch a ride on Highway 190. A passing motorist who'd seen the news reports recognized him and called it in. The 3rd man, who they eventually identified as Robert Sills, was never found in the park. Turns out he'd made it to Pahrump and was arrested there 2 days later trying to steal a car from a grocery store parking lot. The detective called me personally to tell me all 3 were in custody, facing charges that included murder, kidnapping, robbery, and a list of other crimes. They'd found human remains near one of the campsites, buried shallow in the desert sand. Dental records would later confirm it was David Chun. But Chun wasn't their only victim. Over the following weeks, as investigators pieced together the evidence, they connected these men to at least 4 other missing persons cases spanning 2 years. Solo travelers, mostly, people who'd come to Death Valley looking for solitude and instead found these predators. The photographs, the journal entries, the cache supplies, it all painted a picture of an organized operation. They'd been luring people to remote areas or simply waiting for victims to arrive, then robbing and killing them. They'd sell the vehicles, the camping gear, anything of value, and bury the bodies where no one would think to look. Death Valley is vast enough that you could hide a dozen bodies and they might never be found. That thought haunted me. I testified at the preliminary hearings for all 3 men. Seeing them in orange jumpsuits, shackled and surrounded by guards, should have made me feel safer, but it didn't. Leonard Pritchard stared at me the entire time I was on the stand, this cold, empty look that said if he ever got the chance, he'd finish what he'd started. The judge denied bail for all 3, called them flight risks and dangers to society. The prosecutor told me the evidence was overwhelming, that all 3 would likely spend the rest of their lives in prison. Marcus Webb took a plea deal and agreed to testify against the others, confirming what investigators had suspected. They'd been working together deliberately, choosing Death Valley specifically because it was remote and victims were vulnerable. I never went back to Death Valley. Couldn't bring myself to do it, even though it's one of the most beautiful places I'd ever seen. Every time I thought about returning, I'd remember those 3 silhouettes standing in the doorway, watching my van approach, and I'd feel sick. I sold my van a few months later. Couldn't sleep in it anymore without thinking about that night, about the man circling it with who knows what intentions. I moved back into an apartment in Reno, got a regular office job, gave up the whole nomadic lifestyle that had felt so freeing. My ex-wife called when she heard about the case on the news, said she'd been worried about me living that way, that she was glad I was safe. I didn't tell her that safety is an illusion, that bad things can happen anywhere, not just in remote deserts. A year later, the families of the victims held a memorial service at Furnace Creek for everyone who'd been killed. I drove down for it, felt like I owed them that much. I met David Chin's parents, and his mother hugged me and thanked me for helping catch the men who'd killed her son. I didn't feel like I deserved thanks. I'd just been trying to survive, had stumbled into their investigation by accident. But she insisted that my quick thinking, my decision to leave when I did and report what I'd seen, had been the break investigators needed. Ray came with me to the service, and on the drive back to Reno, he said something that stuck with me. "You trusted your gut, Vince. That's why you're here and they're not." I guess he was right. Sometimes your instincts are the only thing standing between you and becoming another missing person statistic, another family wondering what happened to someone they loved. I still think about that night sometimes, wonder what would have happened if I'd ignored that feeling, if I'd convinced myself I was being paranoid and stayed. I probably wouldn't be here to wonder about it. My name is Ramona Vasquez. I'm 52 years old, and I live in Sacramento, California. I'd been divorced for about 5 years when I finally decided to do something just for me. Buy a camper van and take weekends to explore places I'd always wanted to see, but never had time for when I was married and raising kids. My daughters were both in college now, living their own lives, and I was tired of sitting in my empty house wondering where all the years had gone. So I bought this cute little Winnebago Solis. Nothing fancy, but it had everything I needed. I'd taken it out maybe half a dozen times, always to established campgrounds with other people around. But this time I wanted to try something different. I wanted to find one of those spots you see on Instagram, the ones that look like you're the only person on Earth. Big Sur seemed perfect. I'd driven Highway 1 once, years ago, but never stopped to really explore. I did my research, found some blog posts about dispersed camping spots along the old coast road, this narrow dirt route that runs parallel to Highway 1 but up in the hills. The photos looked incredible. Ocean views, no crowds, total privacy. Some of the posts mentioned it was rough terrain and you needed to be careful, but my Solis had decent clearance and I figured I'd driven worse roads. I left Sacramento on a Friday morning in late October, Took my time driving down through Monterey, stopped for lunch in Carmel. By the time I reached Big Sur, it was late afternoon and the fog was starting to roll in from the ocean, creating this ethereal, almost dreamlike atmosphere. I found the turnoff for Old Coast Road and started up. The road was immediately worse than I'd expected, narrow, rutted, with a steep drop on one side and no guardrails. I went slow, gripping the steering wheel tight, second-guessing this whole idea. But I'd come this far, and I'm stubborn when I commit to something. About 3 miles up, I found a pullout that looked promising. It was barely big enough for my van, but it had a relatively flat area and an incredible view of the Pacific through the trees. The fog was thick down below, but up here I could still see patches of blue sky. I pulled in carefully, set my parking brake, and took a deep breath. I'd made it. This was my adventure. I spent the next hour setting things up, leveling the van, arranging my camp chair, making myself a cup of tea. There was no cell service, which I'd expected, but it was strange how quiet everything was. No birds, no wind, just this heavy silence punctuated occasionally by the distant sound of waves. I walked around the area a bit, found an old fire ring someone had made with rocks, some beer cans scattered in the bushes that I picked up and put in my trash bag. People are such slobs sometimes. As the sun started setting, the temperature dropped and the fog began creeping up the hillside. Within an hour, I was completely socked in, couldn't see more than 20 feet in any direction. It was beautiful in a spooky kind of way, everything gray and soft and muffled. I made myself dinner inside the van, pasta with Jared sauce, nothing fancy, and settled in to read a book I'd brought. Around 8 o'clock, I heard a vehicle. The sound was distant at first, but getting closer, an engine straining on the steep grade. I looked out my window, but couldn't see anything through the fog. The vehicle passed my pullout, kept going up the road, and I relaxed. Just someone else looking for a camping spot. But then, maybe 10 minutes later, I heard it coming back down. This time it slowed as it approached my area, and I could see headlights diffuse through the fog. The vehicle stopped. The engine cut off. I waited, expecting to hear voices or the sound of people setting up camp, but there was just silence. Whoever it was, they were sitting there in the dark with their engine off, maybe 50 yards up the road from me. That's when I felt it. That prickle on the back of your neck that tells you something's not right. I couldn't explain why, but I suddenly felt very exposed, very alone, very aware that I was a middle-aged woman by herself in the middle of nowhere with no way to call for help. I turned off my interior lights and sat in the dark, listening. After what felt like forever, I heard a car door open and close. Footsteps on gravel, slow and deliberate, coming down the road toward my van. I held my breath, watching the fog through my window. A figure emerged from the gray, just a shadow at first, then more distinct. A man, tall and thin, wearing a hooded jacket. He walked right past my van, close enough that I could have touched him through the window, and he turned his head to look directly at me. Even in the dark, even through the fog, I could feel his eyes on me. Then he kept walking, disappeared into the fog below my pullout, heading down toward the cliff edge. I sat frozen, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. What was he doing? Why would someone walk down toward the cliff in the dark and fog? It made no sense unless he was trying to circle around, maybe approach my van from a different angle where I wouldn't see him coming. I locked my doors, both the side door and the driver's door, and double-checked them. My hands were shaking. I thought about starting the engine and driving out of there, but the idea of navigating that narrow, treacherous road in complete fog and darkness seemed just as dangerous as staying put. At least here I was locked inside something solid. I grabbed my phone out of habit, even though I knew there was no service, and stared at the blank bars where the signal should be. Minutes passed, maybe 10 or 15, and I didn't hear anything. No footsteps returning, no sounds from wherever that man had gone. The silence was worse than noise would have been, because my imagination filled it with all kinds of horrible possibilities. I kept picturing him crouched somewhere in the fog, watching my van, waiting for me to let my guard down. I thought about my daughters, about how I told them I was going camping but hadn't given them specific details about where. If something happened to me out here, how long would it take for anyone to realize? How long before someone came looking? The fog pressed against my windows like something alive, and every shadow looked like a person. Then I heard his vehicle start up again. The engine roared to life, and I saw the headlights flare through the fog. But instead of driving away, the vehicle moved forward, closer to my pullout. It stopped right at the entrance, blocking the only way out. My stomach dropped. This wasn't random. This wasn't someone just passing through. The engine shut off again, and the headlights died. Now there were two barriers between me and escape, the fog and that vehicle. I was trapped. I tried to think rationally, tried to come up with innocent explanations. Maybe he was just camping nearby and wanted to make sure no one else drove up and blocked him in. But nothing about this felt innocent. The way he'd walked past my van, the way he'd looked at me, the deliberate positioning of his vehicle, it all screamed predator. I heard footsteps again, multiple sets this time. At least two people, maybe three, talking in low voices I couldn't quite make out. They were near his vehicle, and I could hear metal clanking, like they were getting something out of the back. Tools maybe, or weapons. My mind went to the worst places. News stories I'd read about women attacked while camping, about people who disappeared on remote roads and were never found. I thought about the fire ring I'd seen earlier, the beer cans scattered around. How many people had camped in this exact spot? How many had left safely, and how many hadn't? The voices got closer, and I pressed myself against the far wall of my van, as if making myself small would somehow make me invisible. A beam of light swept across my windows, a flashlight, someone walking around my van. Then another light from the opposite side. They were circling me, just like that man had done, but now there were at least two of them, coordinating. I heard one of them laugh, a sound that was somehow more disturbing than if they'd been silent. It was casual, relaxed, like this was fun for them. A voice called out, not loud but clear enough for me to hear. "Hey lady, you alone in there?" I didn't answer. Couldn't have even if I'd wanted to. My throat was closed up with fear. The voice came again, closer now, right outside my driver's side window. "We know you're alone. Saw you setting up earlier. Nice van. Must have cost you some money." They'd been watching me. For how long? Since I'd arrived? Or had they been camped up the road, waiting for someone to show up at this spot? I thought about that blog post I'd read, all those pretty photos that had lured me here. How many other women had read the same post, come to the same place, and run into these men? The flashlight beam hit my window directly, and I squeezed my eyes shut like a child, as if not seeing them meant they couldn't see me. "Come on out," the voice said, and now there was an edge to it. Impatience replacing the fake friendliness. "We just want to talk. Maybe share some beers, have a little party. You look like you could use some company." The way he said party made my skin crawl. This was not going to end with conversation and beer. I heard one of them try my door handle, jiggling it roughly. "Locked up tight," he said to his companion, sounding amused. "Smart lady." Then there was a bang, something hitting the side of my van hard enough to make the whole thing rock. I couldn't help it. I let out a small scream, which was exactly what they wanted. They laughed, both of them now, and someone banged on the side again, harder this time. "There she is. We were wondering if you could talk. Come on out, lady. We're not going to hurt you. We just want to be friendly." Everything about the situation screamed that friendly was the last thing they intended to be. I fumbled for anything I could use as a weapon. Found a small hammer I kept for emergencies, a can of wasp spray under the sink. Pathetic defense against 2 or 3 men, but it was all I had. The banging continued, rhythmic now, like they were trying to scare me into submission. They were succeeding. I was terrified, tears running down my face, my whole body shaking. Then I remembered something. My Solis had a panic alarm, a feature I'd barely paid attention to when the dealer showed it to me. It was supposed to be loud enough to scare off potential thieves. I crawled to the driver's seat and found the button on the key fob. I pressed it, and immediately the van erupted in noise, the horn blaring in short, sharp bursts, lights flashing on and off. The men outside cursed, and I heard them step back. "What the hell?" one of them shouted over the alarm. I kept my finger on the button, letting it wail into the fog. For a moment, I thought it might actually work, that the noise would drive them away or at least make them think twice. But then the banging started again, more aggressive now, angry. They were hitting the van with something metal, and I heard glass crack, one of my windows. Not completely shattered, but damaged. The alarm kept blaring, and I kept pressing the button even though my hand was cramping. Then, through all the noise, I heard something else. Another engine, coming up the road from below. The men heard it too, because the banging stopped abruptly. "Someone's coming," one of them hissed. "We gotta go." There was scrambling, footsteps running, and then I heard their vehicle start up. They peeled out, gravel spraying, engines straining as they drove up the road away from whoever was approaching. The new vehicle pulled into my area, and I could see it was a pickup truck through my cracked window. The alarm was still going, and I finally released the button, plunging everything into sudden silence that felt almost as loud as the noise had been. A man got out of the truck, older, probably in his 60s, with a thick gray beard. He approached my van cautiously, hands visible. "Ma'am, you okay in there?" His voice was rough but genuinely concerned, nothing like the predatory tone of the men who'd just left. I cracked my window an inch, just enough to talk through. "There were men," I managed to say, my voice shaky. "They were trying to get in. They just left when you showed up." The man's expression darkened. "I heard your alarm from way down the road. That's why I came up to check." "How many men?" I told him what I'd seen and heard. At least 2, maybe 3, in a vehicle that had been blocking me in. He pulled out a radio from his belt, and I realized he was wearing a uniform shirt under his jacket. "I'm Dave Moreno, volunteer search and rescue from Monterey County. I live down in the valley, patrol this road sometimes because we get people stuck up here." He spoke into the radio, calling for sheriff's department, giving the location and description of what had happened. "They're going to send a deputy up, but it'll take some time. This road's not easy to navigate. You want to come sit in my truck while we wait? Might be safer than staying in your van." I didn't want to leave my van. Didn't want to be outside where I was vulnerable, but I also didn't want to be alone. I grabbed my phone and my keys and climbed out, looking around nervously like those men might come charging back out of the fog at any second. Dave walked me to his truck, which was a big Ford F-250 with SER logos on the side, and I got in the passenger seat. He kept the engine running, the heater on, and I sat there shaking while he made more calls on his radio. "This isn't the first time," he said after he'd finished with dispatch. "We've had reports this year, maybe 4 or 5 times, about men harassing solo campers up here. Mostly women, sometimes couples. They target people who look vulnerable, who don't have cell service. You're lucky I came by when I did." Dave told me stories while we waited for the deputy. Other incidents, people who'd been robbed, one woman who'd been assaulted and barely escaped. He said the problem was these men knew the area better than law enforcement did, knew all the back roads and hiding spots, could disappear into the hills before anyone could respond. "We catch them sometimes," he said, "but they're usually smart enough to leave before things go too far. Tonight, though, they were getting bold. Damaging your vehicle, that's escalation." I looked back at my van through the fog, could see the cracked window even from a distance, and felt this wave of anger mixed with my fear. That van represented my freedom, my attempt to reclaim some independence, and these men had violated that. They'd made me feel unsafe in the one place I'd thought I could control. The sheriff's deputy arrived about 40 minutes later, a young guy named Rodriguez who looked barely old enough to shave. He took my statement, photographed the damage to my van, and asked if I could identify the men if I saw them again. I described what I'd seen, the tall, thin man in the hooded jacket, the voices, the vehicle blocking my exit, but in the fog and darkness, I hadn't seen faces clearly. Rodriguez said they'd increase patrols in the area, would check known camping spots for suspicious activity, but his tone suggested he wasn't optimistic about finding them tonight. "These guys are probably long gone by now," he admitted. "They know when to cut and run. But we'll file a report, and if we get other incidents, we can start building a pattern." Dave offered to escort me off Old Coast Road, said he wouldn't feel right leaving me up here alone even with my van locked. I accepted gratefully, and we formed a 2-vehicle convoy down that treacherous road, his taillights the only thing keeping me oriented in the thick fog. It took us almost an hour to reach Highway 1, and by the time we did, I was exhausted, not just physically but emotionally drained. Dave pulled over at the intersection and came back to my window. "There's a campground about 10 miles south, state-run, has a camp host and other people. I'd recommend staying there tonight, not trying to find another isolated spot." I nodded, too tired to argue, too scared to be alone anyway. I drove to the campground he'd recommended, paid for a spot, and parked between a huge RV and a family with 3 kids in a tent. It wasn't the peaceful solitude I'd been looking for, but it was safe, and that's all that mattered now. I didn't sleep much. Every sound outside made me jump. Every time someone walked past my van, I was convinced it was those men, that they'd somehow track me down. In the morning, I called my daughter Maria from the campground's office where they had Wi-Fi. She answered on the second ring, and the moment I heard her voice, I started crying again, telling her everything that had happened. She wanted me to come home immediately, said I should give up this whole camping thing, that it was too dangerous for a woman my age. Part of me agreed with her. I drove back to Sacramento that afternoon, my cracked window whistling in the wind, my nerves shot. But another part of me was furious that men like that existed, that they could turn something beautiful into something terrifying, that I couldn't even camp in peace without feeling threatened. I filed an insurance claim for the damage, joined some online groups for women who camp solo, started reading about safety precautions I should have known before. Over the next few weeks, I stayed in touch with Deputy Rodriguez, checking for updates. They'd gotten 3 more reports of harassment on Old Coast Road, all with similar descriptions. Men in their 30s or 40s, traveling in groups, targeting solo campers or small groups. Then, about a month after my incident, Rodriguez called me with news. They caught them, not on Old Coast Road, but near Andrew Molera State Park, about 15 miles north. The men had approached a couple camping in a small trailer, tried the same intimidation tactics. But this time, the couple had a satellite phone and called for help immediately, and park rangers had responded fast enough to catch 2 of the men before they could flee. The third one ran into the hills and was caught by a search and rescue team, Dave's team, actually, the next morning. All 3 were arrested and charged with multiple counts of assault, attempted robbery, criminal threats, and vandalism. Rodriguez said they were looking at serious prison time, especially since they'd found evidence linking them to other crimes in the area. The men's names were released a few days later: Travis Garrett, Kyle Morrison, and Sean Dufresne. All 3 had criminal records, petty theft, assault, drug charges. They'd apparently been living out of a van themselves, moving between Big Sur and Monterey, targeting tourists and campers who they thought wouldn't fight back or report them. The police found stolen camping gear, electronics, even jewelry in their vehicle. They'd been running this operation for almost 8 months, getting bolder with each successful attack. Reading about them in the news made me feel sick and vindicated at the same time. Sick because of how many people they'd hurt, vindicated because I'd trusted my instincts and survived. I was asked to testify at their preliminary hearing to describe what happened that night on Old Coast Road. Walking into that courtroom and seeing all 3 of them sitting at the defense table was surreal and terrifying. Travis Garrett was the tall, thin one I'd seen, and he stared at me the whole time I was on the stand, trying to intimidate me even with deputies standing right there. But I didn't look away. I told the judge everything. How they'd circled my van, damaged it, threatened me. How if Dave hadn't shown up when he did, I didn't know what would have happened. The prosecutor told me later that my testimony, combined with the physical evidence and statements from other victims, made their case airtight. All 3 men accepted plea deals rather than go to trial. Travis got 12 years, Kyle got 10, Sean got 8. After the hearing, I met some of the other victims in the hallway, 3 women who'd experienced similar attacks, and the couple from Andrew Molera who'd helped get these men caught. We stood there sharing our stories, and I realized how lucky I'd been. One woman had been robbed of everything she owned, left stranded on Old Coast Road with no food or water. Another had been physically assaulted when she tried to defend herself. The couple told me how the men had tried to flip their trailer with them inside it. We'd all survived, but we carried the trauma of those encounters. One woman said she'd sold her camper and would never camp again. Another said she only camped in crowded RV parks now, never anywhere remote. I understood their reactions, but I made a different choice. I got my window repaired, installed better locks on my van, bought a satellite communicator and a personal alarm. I took a self-defense class specifically designed for solo travelers. And then, 3 months after the incident, I drove back to Big Sur. Not to Old Coast Road. I'd never go there again, but to that state campground Dave had recommended. I parked in a spot surrounded by other campers, families and retirees and young couples, and I sat outside in my camp chair watching the sunset over the Pacific. It wasn't the isolated, Instagram-perfect experience I'd originally wanted, but it was peaceful. It was healing. Dave Moreno stopped by my campsite that evening, said he'd heard I was back and wanted to check on me. We talked for a while, and he told me he was proud of me for not giving up, for not letting those men steal something I loved. Fear is natural, he said, but it doesn't have to win. We became friends after that, He'd text me sometimes when he was patrolling the back roads, just to check in, and I'd send him photos of my camping trips. Having someone who understood what I'd been through, who didn't judge me for continuing to camp solo, but also respected the caution I now approached it with, meant everything. A year later, I was camped at Point Lobos, in a legitimate campground with a ranger station and cell service and lots of other people around. I'd learned to balance my desire for adventure with realistic safety considerations. I'd learned that being smart wasn't the same as being fearful, that taking precautions wasn't admitting defeat. My daughters still worried about me, but they'd also started coming on trips with me sometimes, bringing their boyfriends, making it family adventures. And every time I set up my camp chair and watched the sun set over the California coast, I thought about that night in the fog on Old Coast Road. I thought about how close I'd come to being another victim, another statistic. But I also thought about how I'd survived, how I'd fought back in my own way, how I'd refused to let those men take away something that brought me joy. That's the real victory. Not that they went to prison, though I'm glad they did, but that I'm still here, still camping, still reclaiming the freedom they tried to steal from me. Some nights, when the fog rolls in and everything gets quiet, I still feel that fear creeping back. But I don't run from it anymore. I sit with it, acknowledge it, and then I remind myself, I survived. I'm stronger than they wanted me to be. And that's enough. My name is Curtis Brennan. I'm 41 years old, and I live in Phoenix, Arizona. I'd been working construction for 20 years, long hours in the blazing sun, and my body was starting to show it. Bad knees, chronic back pain, the kind of wear and tear that reminds you that you're not 25 anymore. My doctor suggested I take some time off, decompress, maybe try something less physically demanding for a while. So I did something I'd been talking about for years but never actually committed to. I bought a used Sprinter van, did a basic conversion myself, and decided to spend a few months traveling the Southwest. My wife had left me 3 years prior, no kids, so there was nothing keeping me tied to Phoenix except my lease, and I'd sublet that to a buddy who needed a place. Joshua Tree was my first real stop. I'd driven through it a few times, but never stayed overnight, never really explored. It was early December, perfect weather, cool at night, but warm during the day, not the scorching hell it becomes in summer. I got there on a Tuesday afternoon, stopped at the ranger station to ask about dispersed camping. The ranger, a woman in her 50s with sun-weathered skin, pointed to some areas on my map where camping was allowed outside the official campgrounds. Just stay on established roads, don't camp right on them, and keep it to one night per spot, she said. Also, watch out for abandoned mines. People get hurt exploring them all the time. I thanked her and headed into the park. I drove around for maybe an hour, checking out different spots, before I found one that felt right. It was off a dirt road near the northwest boundary of the park, close to an area called Queen Valley. There were these massive rock formations all around, those weird twisted Joshua trees that looked like something out of a Dr. Seuss book, and the silence was incredible, not a sound except wind moving through the rocks. I pulled my van into a clearing between two huge boulder piles, set up my camp chair, and cracked open a beer. This was exactly what I needed. No bosses, no deadlines, no noise, just me in the desert and time to think about what I wanted to do with the rest of my life. The sunset was spectacular, the sky turning every shade of orange and purple you can imagine. As it got dark, the stars came out, millions of them, so bright and clear it almost didn't look real. I'd forgotten how dark the night sky could get when you're away from cities. I made myself dinner on my camp stove, just some canned chili heated up, and ate while watching the stars. Around 9 o'clock, I noticed lights in the distance, maybe half a mile away. Another camper, probably someone else who'd found a spot in this area. The lights were stationary, looked like they'd set up camp for the night. I didn't think much of it. Plenty of room out here for everyone. I was getting ready for bed around 10:30 when I saw a light moving. Not the stationary camp lights from before, but a single light, like a headlamp or flashlight, moving across the desert between their camp and mine. It was zigzagging, stopping occasionally, then moving again. I watched it for a few minutes, curious about what someone would be doing wandering around in the dark. Desert hiking at night isn't unheard of. Some people like to avoid the heat, but something about the way this person was moving seemed off. They weren't following any kind of trail or direct path. just wandering seemingly at random, getting closer to my area with each zigzag. The light disappeared behind one of the rock formations, and I lost sight of it for maybe 5 minutes. Then it appeared again, much closer now, maybe 100 yards from my van. I could see it was definitely a headlamp, could make out the shape of a person wearing it, but I couldn't tell much else in the darkness. The person stopped, and the light swept across my van, lingered there for a moment, then swept back. They'd definitely seen me. I expected them to wave or call out, do something to acknowledge my presence, but they just stood there, the light aimed at my van. After what felt like a full minute, but was probably only 20 seconds, they turned and walked back the way they'd come, the light bouncing as they moved. Within a few minutes, they disappeared back toward those distant camp lights. I stood outside my van for a while after that, just watching the darkness, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling that encounter had left me with. It was probably nothing. Maybe they'd been looking for a better camping spot, or checking out the area, or just wandering because they couldn't sleep. But the way they'd stood there, light fixed on my van without saying anything, that bothered me. In my experience, normal people acknowledge each other out here, give a wave or a howdy or something. Silence felt intentional, felt wrong. I climbed into my van, locked the doors even though I usually didn't bother in remote spots, and tried to settle in for the night. My sleeping setup was pretty basic, a futon mattress in the back, some blankets, a pillow. Comfortable enough after a long day. I couldn't sleep though. I kept thinking about that light, about the person behind it. Around midnight, I heard an engine start in the distance, the camp where those lights had been. I sat up, looked out my window, and saw headlights moving. The vehicle was driving away, heading toward the main road out of the area. Good, I thought. They're leaving. But then the engine sound changed, got louder instead of fading. They weren't leaving, they were driving toward me. I watched the headlights approach, bouncing over the rough terrain, until the vehicle pulled up maybe 50 feet from my van. It was a pickup truck, older model, dark-colored. The engine shut off, and the headlights died, plunging everything back into darkness except for the stars overhead. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then I heard a door open and close. Footsteps on gravel and sand, walking around the truck. A light clicked on, that same headlamp from before, and the person walked toward my van. This time I could see them better in the glow of their own light. A man, probably in his late 30s, wearing cargo pants and a dark hoodie. He had this lean, wiry build and moved with an odd jerky quality, like he was tweaking on something. He walked right up to my driver's side window and knocked. 3 sharp raps that made me jump even though I'd been watching him approach. "Hey," he called out, his voice higher than I expected. "You got a spare tire iron?" Mine stripped and I got a flat. It was close to 1 in the morning and he was asking to borrow tools? That didn't make sense. If he had a flat, why had he driven over here instead of dealing with it where he was? And I hadn't heard the telltale thump-thump of a flat tire as he'd driven up. I cracked my window about an inch, just enough to talk through. "I got one, but I'm not opening up right now. It's late. Deal with your flat in the morning when you can see what you're doing." He stood there, the headlamp pointing at my face, blinding me. "Come on, man. I just need to borrow it for 10 minutes. I'll bring it right back." His tone had an edge to it now, impatience mixing with something that sounded almost aggressive. "Sorry," I said, keeping my voice steady. "Not tonight." He stepped back from my window, and I thought maybe he'd give up and leave. Instead, he called out toward his truck. He says no. My stomach dropped. There was someone else in that truck. Another door opened, and a second figure emerged, bigger than the first guy, stocky and tall, wearing jeans and a flannel shirt. He walked up to join his friend, and they both stood there looking at my van. The second guy spoke, his voice deep and rough. "That's not very neighborly. We just need some help." I didn't respond, just sat there in the dark watching them. The first guy started walking around my van, shining his light on it, checking the doors. "Nice setup," he said. "You got a lot of gear in here? Tools? Maybe some cash?" There it was, the real reason for their visit. This wasn't about a flat tire. This was a robbery, plain and simple. They'd seen me arrive, watched me set up camp alone, waited until the middle of the night when I'd be vulnerable, then made their move. The second guy tried my back door handle, found it locked. "Just open up," he said, sounding almost bored, like this was routine for him. "Make it easy on yourself. We just want your stuff. You can keep the van. We're not greedy." The casual way he said it made it somehow more terrifying, like they'd done this before, headed down to assist him. I reached under my seat and pulled out the only weapon I had, a heavy maglite flashlight, one of those big metal ones that doubles as a club. "I'm calling the Rangers," I said, holding up my phone even though I had zero service out here. "They're on their way." The first guy laughed, a harsh sound. "Sure you are, buddy. No service out here. We checked. It's just you and us and a whole lot of empty desert." He was right, and we both knew it. The second guy had moved to my front passenger window and was examining it, like he was figuring out the best way to break it. I turned my key in the ignition. I'd left it there just in case I needed to make a quick exit, and the engine roared to life. Both men stepped back, startled. "Hey, wait," the first guy said, his tone changing to something almost pleading. "Don't be stupid. You go driving out here in the dark, you're gonna hit a rock or get stuck, and then you're really screwed." I didn't wait to hear what else he had to say. I threw the van into drive and hit the gas, not caring about the rough terrain or the darkness or anything except getting away from those two men. My headlights bounced wildly as I drove over rocks and through sand, and I heard something scrape against my undercarriage, but I kept going. In my rearview mirror, I could see them running back to their truck, could see their headlights flare as they started their engine. They were coming after me. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. The dirt road I'd come in on was somewhere ahead of me, but in the dark everything looked the same. Rocks and sand and twisted Joshua trees creating shadows that played tricks on my eyes. I found the road more by luck than skill, felt the transition from rough desert to slightly less rough dirt under my tires. I accelerated as much as I dared, the van swaying and bouncing, my hands gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles were white. The truck behind me was gaining. They knew this area better than I did, or they were just willing to drive more recklessly. Their headlights filled my mirrors, getting closer. I thought about what would happen if they caught me, if they forced me to stop or ran me off the road. 2 against 1, in the middle of nowhere, with no help coming. I'd read enough stories about people who disappeared in national parks to know that sometimes bodies aren't found for years, if ever. The road twisted around a massive rock formation, and I took the turn too fast. My van tilted, 2 wheels lifting off the ground for a horrifying second before slamming back down. Something in the back crashed, probably my cooler or one of my storage bins, but I kept my foot on the gas. The truck behind me made the turn better, smoother, and they were right on my tail now. I could see both men in their cab, illuminated by my taillights, and the passenger was leaning out his window with something in his hand. For a second I thought it was a gun, and I ducked instinctively, but then I heard the metallic clang of something hitting my back door. They were throwing things at me, trying to damage my van or scare me into stopping. Ahead, I saw lights, not just stars, but lights that meant civilization, maybe the main road or a ranger station. I aimed for them, praying they were real and not some trick of exhaustion and adrenaline. The truck was still behind me, but the gap wasn't closing anymore. Maybe they'd realized we were getting too close to areas where other people might be, where their little robbery scheme could turn into something that got them arrested. The lights got brighter, and I realized it was the ranger station, the one I'd stopped at when I'd first arrived. There were vehicles parked there, a ranger truck and what looked like a couple of civilian cars, and lights on inside the building even though it had to be almost 2 in the morning. I pulled into the parking lot going way too fast, slammed on my brakes, and skidded to a stop right in front of the entrance. I looked back and saw the truck had stopped maybe 100 yards down the road, headlights still on, but not moving forward. They were watching, deciding whether to follow through or cut their losses. I jumped out of my van and ran to the ranger station door, pounding on it. A young ranger opened it almost immediately. He'd apparently heard my dramatic entrance and looked alarmed. "Sir, are you okay? What's going on?" I pointed at the truck down the road, trying to catch my breath enough to explain. "Those men, they tried to rob me, chased me." The ranger looked where I was pointing, grabbed his radio, and started calling for backup. By the time he'd finished his call, and we both looked back, the truck was gone. Just taillights disappearing into the darkness, heading away from the station toward the park exit. The ranger, whose name tag said Martinez, got a description from me. The truck, the 2 men, their location, everything I could remember. He said they'd alert law enforcement at all the park exits, would try to intercept them, but his tone suggested he knew they were probably long gone. Another ranger arrived, an older guy named Stevens, and they had me sit down inside while they took my full statement. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely hold the cup of water Martinez brought me. Stevens examined my van while I talked, found the dents from whatever they'd thrown at me, documented the damage with photos. Stevens came back inside and told me they'd found something interesting. A rock that had been thrown at my van had gotten lodged in the back bumper. It had blood on it, and Stevens thought maybe one of the men had cut themselves throwing it, or maybe they'd used it in a previous attack. Either way, it was evidence they could test. He bagged it carefully while Martinez continued taking my statement. They asked if I'd gotten a license plate number on the truck, and I felt stupid admitting I hadn't. I'd been too focused on escaping to think about details like that. Martinez said not to worry, that they had cameras at some of the park entrances and could review footage, try to identify the vehicle that way. He also told me this wasn't the first incident like this in Joshua Tree this year. Apparently, there'd been a string of robberies targeting solo campers over the past 6 months. 8 reported incidents, maybe more that went unreported because people were too scared or embarrassed to come forward. The pattern was always the same. 2 men, usually approaching late at night, using some excuse to get close to the victim's vehicle, then attempting robbery. In 2 cases, the victims had been physically assaulted when they resisted. In 1 case, a woman had been followed for miles before managing to reach a populated area. The Park Service had increased patrols, but Joshua Tree is huge, over 790,000 acres, and 2 men who knew the back roads could disappear easily. "You did the right thing," Stevens said. "Fighting back, running, getting to help. Some people freeze, or they give up their stuff hoping the attackers will leave them alone. Doesn't always work that way. They let me stay in the ranger station for the rest of the night. Said I could sleep on a cot in their break room. I tried, but every time I closed my eyes I saw those men, heard the sound of their truck chasing me through the darkness." Around dawn, Martinez checked on me and said they'd reviewed the entrance camera footage. A dark blue Dodge Ram had entered the park around noon the previous day, had exited around 2:30 in the morning, right after my incident. They'd gotten a partial plate number and had already sent it to the San Bernardino County Sheriff's Office. It was a start, at least. Better than nothing. He also told me they'd sent rangers to the area where I'd been camping, found the men's previous campsite. There was evidence they'd been there for several days, and they'd left behind some interesting things. I drove back with Martinez and Stevens later that morning, once the sun was up and it felt safer. Seeing the area in daylight made the previous night feel almost surreal. How had I navigated this terrain in complete darkness? I could see now how easily I could have crashed, hit a boulder, or gotten stuck in soft sand. The luck or adrenaline or whatever had kept me moving seemed incredible. We reached the spot where the men had been camped, and I could see what Martinez meant about evidence. There were multiple tents, a large cooking setup, empty beer cans, and whiskey bottles everywhere. But more disturbing were the items they'd found buried in a shallow pit. Backpacks, wallets, phones, camping gear, all belonging to other people. This wasn't just opportunistic robbery. These men had been systematically targeting and robbing campers for months. Stevens photographed everything, bagged items as evidence, while Martinez called in what they'd found. I stood there feeling sick, thinking about all the people who'd been victimized by these men, wondering if anyone had been hurt worse than just losing their possessions. One of the backpacks had a name tag on it, Sarah Mitchell, with a Portland address. Martinez made a note of it, said they'd follow up, see if she'd reported anything. As we were finishing up, Martinez's radio crackled. "We got a hit on that plate," the voice said. "Vehicles registered to a Donald Reeves, 43, address in Riverside. Guy's got priors, robbery, assault, possession. We're sending units to his address now." Martinez looked at me with something like satisfaction. "Looks like we might have them." I stayed in a motel in 29 Palms that night. Couldn't bring myself to camp alone again so soon. The next morning, Stevens called me with an update. They'd arrested Donald Reeves at his home in Riverside. He'd been alone, but his truck was the one from the footage, and there was camping gear in the back that matched items reported stolen by other victims. Under questioning, he'd given up his partner, a guy named Marcus Shaw, also from Riverside, with his own criminal record. Shaw was arrested at his girlfriend's apartment a few hours later. Both men were being charged with multiple counts of robbery, assault, conspiracy, and possession of stolen property. The evidence from their campsite, combined with victim statements, made the case solid. Over the next few weeks, I stayed in touch with the Park Service and the Sheriff's Office as the case developed. They'd linked Reeves and Shaw to 11 different robberies across Joshua Tree and the surrounding areas, dating back almost a year. Some victims had reported the incidents, but several hadn't, either because they thought nothing would come of it, or because they were embarrassed, or because they just wanted to forget the whole experience and go home. The investigators reached out to all of them, building a comprehensive case. I was asked to testify at the preliminary hearing, and I agreed, even though the thought of seeing those men again made my stomach turn. I drove back to San Bernardino County in late January, walked into that courtroom, and there they were, Reeves and Shaw, sitting at the defense table in orange jumpsuits. Reeves was the bigger guy, the one who tried my back door and told me to make it easy on myself. Shaw was the wiry one with the headlamp who'd initially approached asking for a tire iron. Seeing them in that controlled environment, surrounded by deputies and lawyers, they looked smaller somehow, less threatening than they had in the dark desert. But when I took the stand and started describing what happened, Reeves stared at me with this cold hatred that reminded me exactly how dangerous they'd been. I told the judge everything. The midnight approach, the lies about needing help, the chase through the darkness, the terror of thinking I might not make it out. The prosecutor walked me through it methodically, and I could see the judge taking notes, her expression getting grimmer as I talked. Other victims testified too. An older couple who'd been camping near Hidden Valley described how the men had taken everything: their camera equipment, cash, even the wife's wedding ring. A young woman who'd been camping alone near Jumbo Rocks broke down crying as she described being followed for almost an hour before finally reaching the main campground where other people were. A photographer from Germany testified through a translator about losing $10,000 worth of camera gear. Hearing all these stories, seeing all these people whose lives had been disrupted or traumatized by Reeves and Shaw, made me realize how lucky I'd actually been. I'd escaped with just some dents in my bumper and a sleepless night. Others had lost so much more. The defense attorneys tried to paint their clients as desperate men who'd fallen on hard times, who'd made bad decisions but weren't violent criminals. But the prosecution had text messages between Reeves and Shaw discussing their hunting trips, laughing about scared campers, dividing up stolen goods. They had the rock with Shaw's blood on it. He'd apparently cut his hand when throwing it at my van. They had the buried cache of stolen property, the pattern of behavior, the multiple victims. The judge denied bail for both men, called them flight risks and dangers to public safety. The trial was set for 6 months out, but the prosecutor told me afterwards she expected plea deals, that the evidence was too overwhelming for them to risk a jury trial. She was right. 3 months later, both men accepted deals. Reeves got 15 years, Shaw got 12. It wasn't as much as some victims wanted. The woman who'd been followed testified that she'd hoped for 25 to life, but it was something. It meant they'd be off the streets for a significant chunk of time. Couldn't hurt anyone else for years. The prosecutor explained that plea deals were often better than trials because they guaranteed convictions without the risk of acquittal or hung juries. I understood that intellectually, but emotionally I felt like they'd gotten off easy. 15 years for terrorizing dozens of people seemed light. But then I remembered what Stevens had told me that first night, that I'd done the right thing by fighting back, by escaping, by reporting. Without victims willing to come forward, men like Reeves and Shaw would keep operating indefinitely. I never went back to Joshua Tree. Couldn't bring myself to do it, even though I knew rationally that the park itself hadn't done anything wrong, that it was still beautiful and worth visiting. But every time I thought about camping there, I remembered driving through the darkness with those headlights chasing me, remembered the sound of that rock hitting my van, remembered the casual way Reeves had told me to make it easy on myself. I sold my Sprinter van a few months after the trial, bought a small RV instead, something bigger, more secure, with thicker walls and better locks. I still traveled, still camped, but I stuck to established campgrounds now, places with camp hosts and other people around. My doctor had suggested I take time off to decompress, and I'd certainly done that, though not in the way either of us expected. The experience changed me, made me more cautious, more aware of how vulnerable we all are when we're out in remote places, how quickly a peaceful night can turn into a nightmare. But it also taught me something about resilience, about trusting your instincts, about the importance of fighting back when you're in danger. I survived because I didn't freeze, didn't give up, didn't believe them when they told me to make it easy. And in the end, that matters more than the fear they made me feel. They're in prison. I'm still here, still traveling, still living my life. That has to count for something. My name is Miranda Shelby. I'm 34 years old, and I live in Sacramento, but this whole thing went down in Big Sur last October. I'd been planning this trip for months. Just me, my converted Sprinter van, and the open road. My boyfriend Derek was supposed to come, but he bailed last minute for some work thing. I should have canceled. I really should have. But I'd already taken the time off, and honestly, I needed to get away from everything. So I packed up Solo, my 3-year-old rescue mutt, loaded up the cooler, and headed south on Highway 1. The drive itself was incredible, you know? That winding coastal highway with the Pacific crashing against the cliffs below. I had my playlist going, windows down, and for the first time in months, I felt like I could actually breathe. I'd researched a few dispersed camping spots online, places where vanlifers said you could park overnight without hassle. There was this one pull-out about 15 miles south of the main Big Sur village, tucked back from the road with just enough space for a few vehicles. Perfect. I got there around 6 in the evening, right as the sun was starting to dip toward the horizon. The spot was better than I'd hoped. Completely empty, surrounded by eucalyptus and oak trees, with this narrow dirt path that led down toward what looked like an old fire road. I backed the van in so I'd have a quick exit if I needed one, something my dad always taught me. "Never park yourself into a corner, Mandy," he'd say. Solo jumped out immediately, sniffing everything like he'd discovered a new planet. I set up my little camp chair outside, cracked open a beer, and just watched the sky turn pink and orange. It was peaceful. Too peaceful, maybe. That's the thing about these remote spots. They're beautiful until the sun goes down and you realize how alone you actually are. I made myself some pasta on the portable stove, shared some chicken with Solo, and tried to shake off this weird feeling that had started creeping up my spine. It wasn't anything specific, just this sense that something felt off. But I told myself I was being paranoid, that this was exactly what I'd come here for: solitude, nature, disconnecting from the city noise. Around 9, I heard a vehicle pull up somewhere behind me, maybe 50 yards back through the trees. I couldn't see it from where I was parked, but I heard doors opening and closing, heard men's voices carrying through the quiet. 3 of them, from what I could tell. They were laughing about something, loud and rowdy, like they'd been drinking. Solo's ears perked up, and he let out this low growl that made my stomach tighten. I'd never heard him do that before. I stepped outside and looked toward where the sound was coming from, but the trees blocked my view completely. The voices continued for a bit, then went quiet. I figured they were settling in for the night too, and I tried to convince myself it was actually safer having other people nearby. You know, safety in numbers and all that. But something about the way they'd gone silent so suddenly bothered me. It felt deliberate, like they were listening as much as I was. I locked the van doors, checked them twice, and pulled the curtains shut on all the windows. Solo stayed alert, his eyes fixed on the back doors, his body tense. I tried to distract myself with my phone, scrolling through Instagram, but the service was spotty at best. Derek had texted earlier asking how the drive went, and I'd responded with some photos of the coastline, but now I couldn't even get the messages to send. I put on my headphones and started an audiobook, something scary actually. Ironic, I know, but it helped drown out the silence in my own thoughts. Solo eventually settled down next to me on the bed, his head resting on my leg, but I could tell he was still on edge. Every few minutes he'd lift his head and stare at the door. Around 11, I heard footsteps. Not casual footsteps, but deliberate ones, moving slowly through the brush outside. They stopped near my van, close enough that I could hear someone breathing. My heart was absolutely pounding. I held my breath, didn't move, just listened. Solo started growling again, louder this time, and whoever was out there must have heard it because the footsteps backed away, crunching through dry leaves and twigs. I waited maybe 5 minutes before I dared to peek through a tiny gap in the curtain. Nothing, just darkness and the shapes of trees moving in the wind. But I knew someone had been there. I could feel it. That's when I noticed something that made my blood run cold. There was a small piece of paper tucked under my windshield wiper. I hadn't put it there. Nobody had been by during the day, which meant someone had walked up to my van, in the dark, and left something. I sat there staring at it through the windshield, This white rectangle fluttering slightly in the breeze, and every instinct I had was screaming at me to start the engine and get the hell out of there. But another part of me, the stupid, curious part, needed to know what it said. Maybe it was just another Vanlifer leaving a friendly note, right? Maybe they were camped nearby and wanted to say hi, introduce themselves. That's what I kept telling myself. But deep down, I knew better. The way those footsteps had moved, slow and purposeful. The way Solo had reacted. The way my gut was twisting itself into knots. This wasn't friendly. This was something else entirely. I grabbed my phone and checked the time. 11:47 p.m. No service still. I thought about waiting until morning, just staying locked inside until sunrise, and then leaving, not even bothering with the note. But what if they came back? What if whatever was on that paper was a threat, and I needed to know what I was dealing with? I pulled on my boots, grabbed my flashlight and my keys, and told Solo to stay. He whined, that high-pitched worried sound dogs make when they know something's wrong. I unlocked the door as quietly as I could and stepped out into the cold night air. The temperature had dropped significantly, and I could see my breath forming little clouds in the beam of my flashlight. I moved quickly to the front of the van, snatched the paper from under the wiper, and practically dove back inside, locking the door behind me. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely unfold it. When I finally did, when I saw what was written there in messy, hurried handwriting, I felt the entire world tilt sideways. It said, "We're watching. Don't try to leave." I must have read those words 100 times, like somehow they'd change if I stared at them long enough. "We're watching. Don't try to leave." My first instinct was to do exactly what they told me not to, fire up the engine and get the hell out of there. But the note said they were watching, which meant they'd see me try. And then what? Would they follow me? Block the road? I didn't even know what kind of vehicle they had, or how many of them there actually were. All I knew was that 3 voices had arrived together, and now someone had crept up to my van in the middle of the night to deliver a threat. I looked at Solo, who was staring at me with those big brown eyes like he was waiting for me to figure this out. "Good boy," I whispered, scratching behind his ears, trying to keep my voice steady even though inside I was absolutely falling apart. I needed to think clearly. Panic wouldn't help me. I grabbed my phone again, still no service. I tried calling 911 anyway, just in case, but the call wouldn't connect. Of course it wouldn't. This is exactly why horror movies happen in places like this. I started running through my options. I could wait until morning and hope they were just trying to scare me, that they'd get bored and leave. But what if they didn't? What if this was just the beginning? I thought about making a run for it on foot, but I'd have to leave the van and everything in it, and where would I even go? The nearest house was probably miles away, and I'd be stumbling through the dark on unfamiliar terrain. That seemed like a great way to get hurt, or worse. Then I remembered something. When I'd pulled in earlier, I'd seen another turnout about a mile back up the highway, one that looked more open and exposed. Maybe if I could get there, somewhere with better visibility and hopefully cell service, I could call for help. But that meant driving past wherever these guys were parked, and the note specifically said not to try to leave. I felt trapped, like a mouse in one of those experiments where all the exits lead to worse things. My mind kept spinning through scenarios, each one more disturbing than the last. Around midnight, I heard the voices again. They were closer this time, maybe 30 yards away, and they weren't trying to be quiet anymore. One of them was laughing, this ugly sound that made my skin crawl. Another one said something I couldn't quite make out, but the third one responded with, "She's still in there." I saw the light moving. They were talking about me, about my van, my flashlight. I immediately turned it off and sat in complete darkness, holding my breath again like somehow that would make me invisible. Solo pressed against my leg, and I could feel him trembling. Or maybe that was me. Probably both of us. "Should we knock?" one of them said, and the others laughed. "Nah, let her sweat it out. She's not going anywhere." The casual cruelty in their voices was terrifying. This wasn't some random encounter. They'd chosen me specifically, targeted me because I was alone, because my van was isolated, because they could. I wanted to scream, to tell them to leave me alone, but I knew that would only make things worse. The voices moved away again, back toward where I assumed they were camped, but I knew they hadn't gone far. They were playing with me, letting me know they were in control. I sat there in the dark for what felt like hours, my mind racing through every self-defense tip I'd ever read online. I had pepper spray in my backpack. I dug it out, and put it on the dashboard within easy reach. I had a small knife I used for camping, and I pulled that out too. Neither felt like enough. What was I going to do if 3 grown men decided to break into my van? Fight them off with a 4-inch blade and some pepper spray? I thought about Derek, about how pissed I was that he'd bailed on this trip. If he were here, would they have left us alone? Probably. These cowards only went after women traveling solo. I'd read enough true crime to know how this usually went. The statistics on violence against solo female travelers flashed through my mind, and I had to physically shake my head to stop spiraling. Around 2 in the morning, I made a decision. I couldn't just sit here waiting for them to decide what happened next. I needed to take control of the situation somehow. I started the engine, screwed the note, and flipped on my headlights. The sudden brightness illuminated the trees around me, and for a split second, I saw a movement. Someone diving behind a thick oak tree about 20 feet away. They'd been standing there, just watching my van in the dark. The sight of that sent such a jolt of fear through me that I almost stalled the engine. But I managed to throw it in drive and started moving forward slowly, carefully, my headlights sweeping across the area. That's when I saw their vehicle, a beat-up brown pickup truck parked at an angle that would have blocked me in if I tried to go backward. They'd planned this. They'd positioned themselves to trap me. As I rolled past their camp, I saw camping gear scattered around, beer cans everywhere, and one of them standing by a fire pit, just staring at me with this creepy smile. He raised his hand and waved slowly, mockingly. I punched the gas and flew down that dirt path faster than was safe, branches scraping the sides of my van, rocks pinging off the undercarriage. I didn't care. I just needed to get to the highway, to civilization, to anywhere that wasn't here. Behind me, I heard their truck engine start up. They were following. Of course they were following. My headlights finally hit the main road, and I took the turn too fast, feeling the van tilt sickeningly to one side before the tires gripped the pavement. I headed north, back toward the village, pushing the van as fast as it would go on those winding roads. In my rearview mirror, I could see their headlights behind me, keeping pace. They weren't right on my bumper. They were hanging back maybe 50 yards, just close enough to let me know they were still there. This wasn't over. I checked my phone desperately every few seconds, waiting for even one bar of service to appear. Nothing. The highway was completely empty. No other cars, no houses with lights on, nothing. Just me, them, and miles of dark coastal road stretching ahead. I'd been driving for maybe 10 minutes when I saw lights up ahead. Not just any lights, but the bright fluorescent glow of a gas station. I nearly cried with relief. It was one of those old school places that looked like it hadn't been updated since the 70s, but right now it looked like the most beautiful thing I'd ever seen. There was a single car parked by the pumps and an attendant visible through the window of the little shop. I pulled in fast, tires squealing, and parked directly under the brightest light I could find. The brown pickup slowed down as it passed the station, and I got my first real look at them. 3 men, just like I'd thought, all probably in their 40s, wearing baseball caps and looking exactly like the kind of guys who'd think this was funny. The driver locked eyes with me for a second, and that smile, that same creepy smile, spread across his face before they continued down the highway. But I knew they weren't gone. They'd probably just loop around and wait. I grabbed Solo and practically ran into the store, my legs shaking so badly I almost tripped over the door frame. The attendant was this older guy, maybe 60, with thick glasses and a name tag that said Ron. He looked up from his magazine, startled by my dramatic entrance. "You okay, miss?" he asked, and something about that simple question just broke whatever composure I'd been holding on to. I started talking fast, words tumbling out, told him about the note, about the men following me, about how scared I was. Ron's expression shifted from confused to concerned to angry in about 3 seconds. Those sons of, he caught himself, pulled out his phone. "I'm calling the sheriff right now. You just stay right here, okay? Don't go back outside." He dialed and started explaining the situation to whoever answered, giving them the description of the truck, the license plate number I'd managed to catch, everything. While he talked, I checked my own phone and finally, I had 2 bars of service. I called Derek. It rang 4 times before he answered, his voice thick with sleep. "Mandy, it's 3 in the morning. What? Derek, I need you to listen." I cut him off, my voice cracking. I told him everything, and I could hear him waking up fully, getting out of bed, probably pacing like he does when he's stressed. Jesus Christ, Miranda. Okay. You're at a gas station. You're safe right now. For now, I said, glancing nervously out the window. The highway was still empty, but I kept expecting to see those headlights reappear. The attendant called the cops. They're coming. Good. That's good. Don't leave that gas station until they get there. You hear me? I don't care if it takes all night. His voice was firm, protective, and honestly, it helped ground me a little. We stayed on the phone, and he kept me talking about random stuff, his annoying coworker, the new coffee place that opened near our apartment, anything to keep my mind from spiraling. Ron brought me a bottle of water and a candy bar, wouldn't let me pay for either. Sheriff's about 20 minutes out, he said. Probably would have been faster, but they're coming from Monterey. 20 minutes felt like 20 hours. I sat on the floor behind the counter with Solo, who seemed calmer now that we were somewhere lit and warm. Ron kept watch by the window, and at one point he pulled out this ancient shotgun from under the counter. Just in case, he said when he saw my expression. Been working nights here for 30 years. Never had to use it, but I'll be damned if tonight's gonna be the first time. I'd never been so grateful for a stranger in my entire life. Around 3:30, the brown pickup came back. They drove past slowly, obviously looking for my van, and when they spotted it, they pulled into the parking lot across the street. Not the gas station itself, but close enough to watch. My heart dropped into my stomach. There they are, I whispered to Ron, pointing. He squinted through the window, then picked up his phone and called the sheriff back, updating them. They're here right now, just sitting across the street. Yeah, brown Chevy, late 90s maybe. License plate, he read off the numbers again. The three men didn't get out of their truck, they just sat there, idling, waiting. It was a standoff. They knew I'd called for help. They had to know, but they didn't seem worried about it. That scared me more than anything else. Either they were incredibly stupid, or they thought they could talk their way out of whatever trouble was coming. I watched them through the window, these three shapes backlit by their dashboard lights, and tried to understand what they'd planned to do if I hadn't gotten away. Rob me? Hurt me? Worse? My imagination went to dark places I didn't want to explore. Derek was still on the phone, and I could hear him moving around his apartment, getting dressed. I'm coming down there, he said. I'll leave right now. I can be there in 5 hours. No, I said firmly. I'm okay. The police are almost here. I just want to get home. What I didn't say was that I needed him to stay where he was, safe, because I couldn't handle worrying about him driving these roads at night too. Finally, blessedly, I saw red and blue lights approaching from the north. 2 sheriff's vehicles, coming in fast. The moment those lights appeared, the brown pickup suddenly reversed and tried to peel out of the parking lot, heading south. But they'd waited too long. One of the sheriff's cars cut them off before they could get far, blocking the exit while the second car pulled in behind them. I watched through the window as the deputies got out, hands on their weapons, and ordered the men out of the truck. All 3 of them complied, moving slow with their hands up, and they were put in handcuffs right there in the parking lot. The whole thing felt surreal, like I was watching a scene from a TV show instead of my actual life. Ron let out a long breath. Well, that's that, he said, putting his shotgun away. One of the deputies came into the station to talk to me. A tall woman, probably in her 30s with her hair pulled back tight. Her name badge said Deputy Chun, and her expression was serious but kind. She asked me to walk her through everything from the beginning, and I did, showing her the note which I'd shoved in my pocket. She bagged it as evidence, then told me they'd found similar notes in the men's truck. Notes they'd apparently been planning to leave on other vehicles. You weren't their first target, Deputy Chin said quietly. We've had 3 other reports this month of women being harassed at dispersed camping sites in this area. But nobody got a good description before, and nobody managed to get evidence like this note. You did the right thing getting out of there when you did. The deputies kept me at the gas station for another hour, taking my statement and getting every detail they could. Deputy Chun explained that the 3 men, brothers, apparently, which somehow made it even more disturbing, had been arrested on multiple charges including stalking, harassment, and criminal threats. They'd found rope, duct tape, and other stuff in their truck that they couldn't explain away as normal camping gear. That information hit me like a punch to the gut. I thought maybe they were just trying to scare me, mess with a solo female traveler for kicks, but the evidence suggested they'd been planning something much worse. We'll need you to come by the station later today to sign your official statement, Deputy Chin said, handing me her card. But for now, you're free to go. Do you have somewhere safe to stay tonight? I nodded, told her I'd get a hotel room in Carmel or Monterey, somewhere with people around and actual locks on the doors. She walked me out to my van, checked it over to make sure they hadn't done anything to it while I'd been inside, then followed me in her patrol car until I was well clear of the area. I ended up at a Holiday Inn in Monterey, one of those chain hotels right off the highway where you can see the parking lot from your window. I'd never been so happy to be somewhere generic and normal and safe. I checked in around 5 in the morning, and the desk clerk didn't even blink at my disheveled appearance or the fact that I had a dog with me. I paid extra for the pet fee, got the key card, and practically collapsed into the room. It was basic, 2 double beds, a TV bolted to the dresser, that familiar hotel smell of industrial cleaning products. But to me it felt like a 5-star resort. I deadbolt the door, put the chain on, and even pushed one of the chairs against the handle for good measure. Solo jumped up on the bed and immediately passed out, and I just stood there for a minute, shaking, finally letting myself feel everything I'd been holding back. The fear, the anger, the sheer disbelief that this had happened. I'd been so careful. I'd researched the area, told people where I'd be, taken every precaution I could think of, and it still almost wasn't enough. I called Derek again to let him know I was okay, that I was at a hotel, that the guys had been arrested. He wanted every detail, and I gave them to him even though talking about it made my hands start shaking again. "I'm still coming down there," he said. "I'm already in the car. I'll be there by noon." Part of me wanted to argue, to tell him it wasn't necessary, but honestly, I really wanted to see him. So I gave him the hotel address and told him to drive safe. Then I called my dad, because even though I'm 34 years old, sometimes you just need your dad, you know? He answered on the first ring. He's always been an early riser, and when I told him what happened, his voice went cold in that way it does when he's really angry. "You're okay though? They didn't touch you?" "I'm fine, Dad. Just shaken up." "Those bastards," he muttered. "They're in jail." "Yeah, multiple charges, according to the deputy." "Good. That's where they belong." We talked for a while longer, and he made me promise I'd never go on a solo camping trip again, at least not in remote areas like that. Around 7, I managed to fall asleep for a few hours, but it wasn't restful. I kept jerking awake, thinking I heard footsteps outside the door or tapping on the window. Solo would lift his head each time, check that everything was okay, then curl back up against me. When I finally woke up for real around 10, I felt like I'd been hit by a truck. Every muscle in my body ached from the tension I'd been carrying all night. I took a long hot shower, letting the water wash away some of the fear and grime, then ordered room service, a massive breakfast with pancakes and bacon and eggs and coffee. So much coffee. While I ate, I scrolled through my phone and saw that the story had already hit the local news. 3 men arrested in Big Sur stalking case, the headline read, and there was a brief article about how they'd been targeting solo female travelers at dispersed camping sites. The article mentioned that I'd managed to escape and alert authorities, but thankfully didn't include my name. Reading it made the whole thing feel real in a different way. Derek arrived around noon, looking exhausted and worried and relieved all at once. The moment I opened the door, he pulled me into this crushing hug, and I just let myself fall apart a little bit, crying into his shoulder while he held me. "I'm so sorry," he kept saying. "I should have been there. I'm so sorry. It's not your fault," I told him, but he just shook his head. We spent the rest of the day in that hotel room, ordering pizza for lunch, watching terrible daytime TV, just being normal and safe and together. Solo was thrilled to have both of us there. Running back and forth between the beds like this was the best day of his life. That dog had no idea how close things had come to going horribly wrong. Around 4 in the afternoon, I went to the sheriff's station to sign my official statement. Deputy Chun was there, and she updated me on the case. All 3 men were being held without bail, and they'd already started talking, trying to cut deals by throwing each other under the bus. Apparently, the oldest brother, the driver, had a prior conviction for assault. The deputy also told me something that made my blood run cold. They'd found photos on one of their phones, photos of other women at other campsites, taken from a distance without the women knowing. Dozens of photos spanning back months. "You weren't just lucky," Deputy Chin said, looking at me seriously. "You were smart. You trusted your instincts, you got out when you could, and you got help." A lot of their other targets didn't realize they were in danger until it was too late, or they convinced themselves they were overreacting. You probably saved yourself from something really bad." I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. She walked me out to where Derek was waiting in the parking lot, shook my hand firmly, and told me if I ever needed anything to call her directly. As we drove back to the hotel, I looked out at the beautiful California coastline, the ocean sparkling in the afternoon sun, and felt this complicated mix of emotions. This place that had seemed so peaceful and perfect yesterday now felt tainted, dangerous. But I also felt something else. Pride, maybe? Relief? I'd survived. I'd made the right choices in the moment. And those men were in jail where they couldn't hurt anyone else. Derek and I stayed in Monterey for 2 more days before heading back to Sacramento. I needed that time to decompress, to feel safe again, to stop jumping at every unexpected sound. We spent those days doing touristy stuff, walking along Cannery Row, visiting the aquarium, eating overpriced seafood at restaurants with ocean views. Normal couple things that helped remind me the world wasn't just full of dangerous people lurking in dark places. Solo loved the beach, chasing seagulls and digging holes in the sand like he'd never seen anything so exciting in his life. Watching him be so happy and carefree helped me relax a little too. But even in those peaceful moments, I'd catch myself scanning the area, checking faces in crowds, making sure nobody was watching me too closely. Deputy Chun had warned me that might happen, that hypervigilance after a traumatic event was completely normal. She'd given me some resources for counseling if I needed it, and I'd already scheduled an appointment for when I got home. On our last evening there, Derek and I sat on the hotel balcony watching the sunset, and he asked me the question I'd been dreading. "Are you going to keep doing Vanlife stuff?" I'd been thinking about that a lot over the past couple days. Part of me wanted to sell the van immediately, to never think about camping or road trips again, to just stay in the city where it was safe and predictable. But another part of me was pissed off at the idea of letting those 3 assholes take something away from me that I loved. "I don't know," I said honestly. "Maybe, but differently. Not solo anymore, that's for sure. And definitely not in remote areas." Derek reached over and took my hand. "Whatever you decide, I'm in. You want to do a trip together? I'll take the time off, for real this time. You want to sell it? We'll sell it. You want to just let it sit in storage for a while? That's fine too." I appreciated that he wasn't trying to tell me what to do, wasn't minimizing what happened or rushing me to get over it. The drive back to Sacramento was long, but uneventful. We took Highway 101 instead of the coastal route. I wasn't ready to drive past Big Sur again. Maybe wouldn't be for a long time. Every few hours we'd stop at a rest area or restaurant, and Derek would check in, make sure I was doing okay. Solo slept in the back most of the way, exhausted from all the beach running. When we finally pulled into our apartment complex around 8 that evening, I felt this overwhelming sense of relief. Home. Safe. Normal. I could see our neighbors' lights on, hear the sounds of families having dinner, smell someone grilling on their patio. All these ordinary signs of life that I'd taken for granted before. Derek helped me unload the van, and we decided to leave the full unpacking for tomorrow. That night, lying in our own bed with Solo snoring on his dog bed in the corner and Derek's arm around me, I finally slept properly for the first time in days. No nightmares, no waking up in a panic, just deep, exhausted sleep. The next few weeks were a weird adjustment. I went back to work. I'm a graphic designer, work from home mostly, and tried to fall back into my regular routine. But everything felt different now. I'd always been pretty independent, confident in my ability to handle myself. And this whole experience had shaken that. Not in a completely bad way, though. It made me more aware, more careful, more willing to trust my instincts. When my gut said something was off, I listened now instead of talking myself out of it. Deputy Chin called me a few times with updates on the case. The 3 brothers had been formally charged with stalking, criminal threats, possession of burglary tools, and a bunch of other stuff. Their trial was scheduled for early next year, and I'd have to testify, which I wasn't looking forward to but knew was necessary. She also told me that 2 other women had come forward after seeing the news coverage. Women who'd been harassed by the same men at different campsites, but had been too scared or embarrassed to report it at the time. Knowing that my report had encouraged others to speak up made me feel like something good had come from this nightmare. About a month after everything happened, I was scrolling through Instagram and saw that several Vanlife influencers were talking about what happened to me. The story had spread through the community, not with my name attached, thankfully, but everyone knew the basic details. A lot of people were sharing safety tips, discussing whether solo female van life was worth the risk, debating whether we should have to change our behavior because of dangerous men or whether society should do better about protecting women. Reading through the comments was intense. Some people said I'd been stupid to camp alone in a remote area, that I should have known better. Those comments stung, made me angry. But way more people were supportive, sharing their own scary experiences, thanking me for reporting what happened, saying I'd been brave. One woman messaged me directly. Somehow she'd figured out it was me, and told me that reading about what happened had made her cancel a solo trip she'd been planning to the same area. "You might have saved my life," she wrote. That hit me hard. Made me cry, actually. I still have the van. Haven't sold it, haven't gotten rid of it. It's parked in our complex right now, and sometimes I go sit in it, trying to reclaim it as a safe space instead of a reminder of that horrible night. Derek and I have talked about doing a trip together in the spring, maybe heading up to Oregon, staying at established campgrounds with other people around. Baby steps. I've also started going to therapy, working through the trauma and the hypervigilance and the anger. My therapist says I'm doing really well, that I'm processing everything in a healthy way. Some days I believe her. Some days I still feel broken and scared and furious that this happened. But I'm getting there. The 3 men are still in jail awaiting trial, and according to Deputy Sean, they're likely to get significant prison time given their prior records and the evidence against them. That helps, knowing they can't do this to anyone else, at least not for a long while. And you know what? I'm proud of myself. For trusting my instincts, for getting out when I could, for fighting back by making sure they faced consequences. Those men tried to make me a victim, tried to take my power away. But I'm still here, still living my life, still planning future adventures. They didn't win, and that matters more than anything else.